I knocked on my son's front door on December 22nd, and he opened it with the same set of eyes I had watched grow from a boy into a man. Only this time those eyes slid past me as if I were a coat hung on a peg. He said, without a tremor, and with the politeness of a man returning change, "You're not invited to Christmas. Only my wife's parents." Those words fell like a plate from my hand. It shattered, and the sound of it seemed, absurdly, to be the last honest noise I would hear in that house. How does a mother answer when her child tells her she is not welcome in the place she once ironed his school shirts and sewed the cuffs, the place where every Christmas had been a story he learned by heart? How does one count the cost of a single phrase? I will tell you. The cost is not only that night of sugar cookies and candles. The cost is the hollowing out that begins afterward, the small thefts that feel at first like the wind taking the last leaf from a tree, and then, imperceptibly, the tree itself. I speak to you now with my hands around a chipped mug that still smells faintly of lemon and tepid tea, and with a mason jar on my kitchen shelf full of pennies and small hopes. That jar, you should know, was once filled by my late husband Tom on the kitchen table while we argued over whether to buy coal or save for the doctor. He would toss in whatever he found in his trousers and wink at me, saying, "For a rainy day and for you, Mary." Those pennies were not mere metal. They were an accounting of decades of love. They are the sanctified currency of a life lived within modest means, of patience paid in loose change. I kept my old pearls, stringy, slightly yellowed from years of perfume and Sunday dinners, in a tin by the tea towels. They were never extravagant, but they were mine, my dignity on a string. I folded a letter my son had once written to me, in a school scribble promising to look after his old mother, and kept it in the same drawer as my recipe for onion soup. These objects hum in my memory like church bells. They will be important. I mention them now so you, reader, will notice later when they ache and when they become weapons or witnesses. My ordinary world was small, neat, and warm. It smelled of boiled cabbage in autumn and of soap in the spring. I knew every hill behind our town, every brick in the school he used to race across, every creak of our porch. I had never been rich. My son's wife, Hannah, came from a different catalog of life. Her family arrived with lacquered floors, porcelain names on invitations, and a way of smiling that made the penny jar look, in their eyes, like a quaint museum exhibit. She wore the kind of gloves that never learned the language of dishwater, and her parents, who were to be the new guests at their table, measured time by flights and invitations, not by the slow simmer of stockpots. It pricked me, but I was proud. My boy had married into comfort. Did I imagine that comfort would come to own him? Perhaps I was naive. Perhaps I wanted a better life for him, so greed could not ever be blamed on my hands. We had love, and what else does a parent have but the stubborn hope that love is armor? At first there were small signs, a photograph rearranged, a guest chair moved, a holiday card that mentioned family traditions, while conspicuously omitting the names of those who had taught their son to carve the turkey. These things, I told myself, were unimportant. I had been wrong. They were the first stones rolled down a slope. I remember the Sunday in late November when I brought over my mason jar of pennies, as usual, for the grandchildren to marvel at. The house smelled of rosemary and wax. Hannah greeted me with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and my son, Mark, put his hand on my shoulder like someone remembering a stranger's name. "Mom," he said, "Hannah's parents are coming this year. It's more comfortable for them if we keep it small." His voice was careful. "We thought it best." I held onto the counter because my knees are no longer faithful. And the chipped mug in my bag, the one I have used for 30 years and which bears a thin white line like a scar, rattled against a carton of eggs. "Keep it small," I repeated, because I wanted to believe he had misspoken. "Like last year?" I asked. He smiled the way a man smiles at a child asking for the moon, and I felt something inside me fold. That night I went home and placed the mason jar on the highest shelf, where dust collects and time takes shape. I laid the pearls on the kitchen towel as if wrapping a small secret. They had never been cruel before, not really. There were arguments, of course. Who could live without them? But always with the ritual of apology. Hannah, with her precise $50 words, and Mark, who would look at me apologetically and then forget. I thought vaguely that this estrangement might be a passing cloud, but the cloud refused to leave. Instead, it sent rain that found every crack. 2 weeks later, on the afternoon of December 8th at 4:30 p.m., a courier came with an envelope bearing the neat name of Mason and Reed Attorneys. I was sipping tea and humming an old hymn when the bell rang. Mark did not come to the door. Hannah signed for the parcel in long, careful handwriting. I watched from the bus stop bench across the street because habit keeps one at the ready for small dramas. There was an unpleasant ease to their movement, the way a hand closes on a bank book. The envelope was thick, and their faces when it arrived had the same economy as a bank balance, full of calculation. Inside the envelope, later that night when the children had been tucked into sheets embroidered by other women, there lay a form, Durable Power of Attorney, signed April 3rd of that year. The name signed was Mark's, and the hand that had drawn the line of my son's signature had been careful and final. I stared at the document until the ink ran like a puddle in my imagination. Durable power of attorney, a legal thing I had seen in films, gives another person the authority to make decisions. It can, in a whisper, hand the keys of one's life to someone else. I do not pretend I was the most vigilant woman. I trusted my son when he promised. But how does one explain the peculiar chill of reading a piece of paper that looks like a map of one's future and finding a route drawn that does not include you? The durable power of attorney pertained to his affairs and to any matters in my best interest, it read, and it bore a date, April 3rd. That date lodged itself under my ribs like a splinter. 2 days before the spring gala they'd hosted, when I had brought a trifle and he had kissed my cheek. 2 days before. Was that accidental? Did a gala demand the erasure of a mother? I went to ask him. I stood on his blown mat porch and felt the cool of his foyer like the wash of a stranger's home. He greeted me with forced warmth and offered a seat in a parlor where the family photographs were new, framed like art pieces that belonged in galleries rather than on a mantel. I held the document like one might hold a bird with a broken wing, out of pity and horror that such a thing could have been mended earlier. "Why did you sign this?" I asked. "Why April 3rd? He looked at the form as if it were a riddle, and his brow knitted in the way that meant he was practicing his forgetfulness. "It was for convenience," he said. "For paperwork. For the house if anything were to—" He stopped. He had a way of cutting through sentences, a practice he adopted from Hannah's family. "We thought it best, Mom. We thought. Those 2 words became like frost on the windows of my life. Someone else began to decide for me before I could know there was a decision to be made. I began to find things missing. A photograph of my mother on the mantel, replaced by a modern print of an empty beach. My name absent from the holiday cards mailed to friends whose pregnancies I had celebrated. Once, when I reached for my pearls to fasten at New Year's, the ritual that made me feel human again, they were not in the tin. I searched the drawers with that terrible patient man's logic that says if something is missing, the world has been rearranged. Under a stack of bills and a glossy magazine, I found a note in Hannah's handwriting. "Keeping these safe for sentimental reasons." Sentimental reasons? As if my dignity were an ornament in a glass case. My son, when confronted, would tilt his head and say things like, "I'll make it up to you," or "You're being sensitive." Who among you has not been told you are sensitive when you are wounded? It is an old trick to call sorrow a sensitivity. It renders the wound into a personality trait. I took to walking with my fingers on the seam of my coat as if I were holding myself together. Sometimes I would sit at my window and watch their house across the lane, lights glowing like promises. I would tell myself I was being unreasonable, that the new family dynamics required time. But then the bank letter arrived, a polite, numbered missive indicating that a transfer on account 44802 had been authorized, an amount roughly equal to $230,000, moved on June 14th to an account described as H. Whitmore, Family Trust. That number lodged in me not as an abstract figure but as the weight of a life's worth of coal and curtains. $230,000. The pennies in my mason jar could not so bluntly measure it. The amount meant that separate worlds had accounts with different ledgers. I found myself listening at doors. I am not proud of every trick a woman of my age will invent when she is pushed. But there is a cunning in those who have ironed shirts for a family and also lost a child's boot in a mud puddle because she was watching another child. I learned to listen to the hush of voices in kitchen parlors, to the small rattles of keys that mean someone is locking you out. One night, through the sliver of a half-open door, I heard Hannah say to Mark, in a voice edged with a pride I did not recognize, "We've arranged everything. All that's left is to make it official." I froze like a hen startled at the sound of a fox. Official? For what? For deciding who would sit at table? For deciding which faces the future would remember? My heart thudded with the slow certainty of a bell tolling. I dug through an old box and pulled out a letter Mark had written at 12 years old. The one where he promised, in shaky handwriting, "I'll always take care of you, Mom." I read it 3 times, and then I found myself writing across the margins like carvers in ancient wood. Do you remember this promise? I left that note in his mailbox and waited for him to call. He sent a text. "Busy. Call later." Later never came. I never expected what I found in that drawer. He had changed. And I must admit with the frankness of confession that I had underestimated the slow poison of new affections. How a mother can be dethroned not by a thunder, but by a smile that forgets to include her. The house that used to announce his coming with the sound of slippers and a child's shout now answered with a polite echo and locked doors. A moral truth dawned on me. But like all great truths, it arrived late. Love, unguarded, can be mistaken for weakness. And weakness, if not turned into vigilance, becomes an invitation. I had loved without measuring, and they had measured me in return. The wind had begun to change. I felt it in the way the family portraits seemed to look away in shame. I did not know yet how I would answer. But when I crept into the study one evening, the lamp still warm and the curtains half drawn, there was a file left carelessly on the desk. My name was on it. My hands trembled as I lifted the folder, not because I feared the pages, but because I loved the man who had once taught me to tie a tie and now might have tied a noose for us both. One sentence I read made everything tilt. Last will and testament, to be executed upon death of grantor. Beneath that, in careful print, a codicil referenced April 3rd and the durable power of attorney. I had been reading the signs like tea leaves. Now the reading was explicit. There was more, a list of assets, the address of a safe deposit box, and as if the page were mocking me, a line that read, "Primary beneficiary, H. Whitmore." My name did not appear. My pearls did not appear. The mason jar did not appear. Only initials and accounts and a ledger that had the coldness of finality. I closed the folder and pressed it to my chest the way one presses a child to stop him from crying. I felt small and very old, but beneath that smallness began a heat. Not the foolish warmth of a woman begging for scraps, but a coiling readiness. The story had slid into a chapter I did not want to read but was compelled to. I would not, I told myself, be a character in someone else's play who had been written out with a stroke of a pen. A single fact remained to be decided. Would I speak and be dismissed? Or would I learn to count my pennies and my strengths and teach myself the mechanics of justice? I had been a mother. I could be patient. I had ironed shirts. I understood the art of smoothing creases. Yet I had also kept a tin of pearls, and pearls cannot be melted into water. They keep their shape. I did not know then the shape that my life would take after that desk and those names. But I knew that the room had been opened, a door ajar into a corridor lined with portraits of other people's choices. I closed the door softly behind me and carried the folder home. Tucked under my arm like contraband or like a prayer, I never expected what I would read next. Justice, like a sword, waits only for hands willing to lift it. They told me once, when I was a girl helping my mother with the washing, that a loose thread will always find a way to the edge of a garment. If you leave it, the seam will come undone. So I treated that folder on my kitchen table like a loose thread and began to follow it, stitch by cautious stitch, through the house where my son lived and through the papers where decisions were disguised as formality. I moved as quietly as a woman who has learned to make lists of small things, names, dates, times. On December 28th at 9:15 a.m., I walked into Mason & Reed Attorneys with the old back that remembers how to stand straight when disgrace arrives. I had the durable power of attorney copy folded in my coat. The firm smelled like paper and polish. The receptionist smiled with the kind of training that oils a smile until it is mechanically smooth. "I'm here about a file," I said. There was a durable power of attorney signed on April 3rd. Her eyes registered me like a stamp on an envelope. Present, but not essential. They told me the records were private, that I needed proof of interest, that I could petition the clerk. They said many things meant to make someone like me, a woman with a mason jar and a chipped mug, feel as small as the label on a can. I left with a list of legal steps I did not know how to perform and the scent of their cologne on my coat. My hands had begun to learn the language of paper, how to read a signature like a map of a hand. Mark's signature had rounded letters, a lazy M that looped, and a final slash like a fisherman's catch. On the durable power of attorney on April 3rd, the M was sharper, more deliberate. It was not the hand of the boy who used to scrawl promissory notes on the backs of school books. I learned to go to places where paper sleeps, the county recorder's office, the bank where accounts have little guarded doors, the safe deposit room behind a steel door that smells like money and secrets. The bank manager, a thin man with a name tag that read L. Patterson, frowned when I asked for records. "We need a court order," he said, the script practiced like a prayer. "We can't divulge that information." His hands were clean of story. But habits taught me how to listen for kindness like a map. I sat in the lobby with my chipped mug wrapped in a paper napkin and watched the comings and goings. I watched the vault door swing behind the manager like the mouth of a sleeping beast. Someone who has ironed collars for 50 years learns to notice the small things about people that reveal the truth of them. A stain on a cuff, the way a thumb rubs a coin. I noticed that Hannah always kept her gloves even in the house, and that she now had a new economy to her gestures. She closed doors not with the weight of wood, but with the lightness of another person's confidence. A friend, Mrs. Alvarez from the church, who used to send me cookies and who keeps a roster of people who have needed help, told me to get a copy of the last will and testament from probate court. "If there was a will," she said. "In that practical way some women talk of children in shoes. It will have been probated there." I went the next morning on January 2nd at 10 a.m. and found myself in a room where people's endings are recorded like weather. There, on a gray folder stamped with a county seal, was a document that changed the axis of my life. Last Will and Testament of Grant Robert Whitmore, dated March 12, 2018, filed under case number 2018 P774. I read and reread the lines until the ink blurred into the soup I had left on the stove that morning. The last will named primary beneficiaries and an executor. The primary beneficiary for the household estate, house, contents, and personal effects of sentimental value was, according to that will, Margaret Whitmore, my legal name. The executor was named as Mark Whitmore. There was a codicil dated April 2nd, 2024, that amended the distribution of a family trust to be split equally amongst the children should the grantor predecease. But then there was another paper in the file, and it struck me like a bell, a typed, notarized codicil dated April 3rd, 2024, the day after the codicil that superseded the prior and named H. Whitmore, family, trust as the primary beneficiary for the trust accounts and identified Hannah Whitmore as the recipient of personal effects of value. The signature on that April 3rd paper matched Mark's signature on the durable power of attorney I had already found. I had the feeling one sometimes has when a ship passes in fog, the outline of something huge, and then the knowledge that it is moving toward you. Why would a codicil be added the day after another? Who benefits from such a midnight amendment? The name H. Whitmore appeared like a stain across the family ledger. I took photocopies. The clerk handed them over with a neutral expression. She did not understand that these were more than paper to me. They were a map with an erased home. I hung the copies on my kitchen wall with a magnet shaped like a rooster and began to compare handwriting. My son's handwriting had changed over the years like a face with age, but there are habits in a hand as in a voice. I called my old friend Paul, who had been the proprietor at the post office and who once trained with a local notary. He came over on January 6th at 3:45 p.m., with a thermos of coffee and a pair of reading glasses that sat on his nose like a question mark. "Bring me the documents," he said. Paul held the papers as if they were religious objects, and he ran his finger along the signatures. He squinted, and then he said the word I had been dreading and yearning to hear: forgery. He demonstrated for me how loops were created where my son's hand usually hesitated, how a flourish was copied where his stroke would have been blunt. "Someone practiced this," Paul said, and his voice, low and plain, carried within it the weight of the obvious. I took Paul's quiet verdict and folded it into my pocket like a small weapon. I began to act like a farmer who has found a mole in the henhouse. You dig deeper. I went to the bank again, armed this time with the probate case number and Paul's sworn statement. Not a legal affidavit, only the observation of a man who had seen many hands sign post office registers. The bank manager's patience thinned. "We can look up transfers with a subpoena," he said, and his answer was like a closed book. "We will require legal representation to issue one." So I did a thing I had not planned. I wrote down the name of every lawyer I could think of, and I visited the free legal aid clinic on January 10th. The paralegal there, a woman named Lydia, with a quick smile and quicker fingers, read my summary and narrowed her eyes in that way the competent have. "This looks like conversion of assets," she said. "Possibly elder financial abuse if there is undue influence." She told me to come back with more evidence, and she handed me a list of items that could form a case: bank statements, copies of wills, proof of transfer, pawnshop receipts for personal items missing. A small thief of dignity had become a procession of theft. I learned that the pearls had been pawned on July 2nd at Midtown Pawnbrokers for $420. The receipt had Hannah's signature on the back, in neat letters. The banker, with a cough that sounded like an apology, handed over a redacted copy of transfer records after I signed an affidavit swearing I had an interest. The transfer, $230,000, had been authorized June 14th at 11:23 a.m. Account 44802 to an account labeled H. Whitmore, Family Trust. Account number ending in 7624. The transfer's memo read, "Family Trust distribution per codicil." The bank manager, who had assumed my silence, told me that the bank had followed a document-bearing process. "We relied on documentation presented by the durable power of attorney," he said, as if a form alone could singe a conscience. I went to Midtown Pawnbrokers on a Thursday at 2 p.m. and found my pearls glazed in a tray of trinkets like prisoners in a lineup. The pawnbroker, a man with gold tooth and a ledger mind, could not deny the signature. "Signed for them," he said, as if that ended the story. There was a receipt, transaction 1MTP 2024-1702. I felt the room spin as if I were at sea, but I clung to the counter like a rope. I took a photograph of the receipt and left with the pearl's memory burning in my palm. I returned home and placed the photograph in the mason jar beside the pennies, then sealed the lid like one seals a letter. And then I listened. I learned that listening is not only the act of placing one's ear to a door. It is the art of sitting where voices drift like perfume. On January 15th at 6:10 p.m., I happened to be walking past their house when I heard a ringing phone through the open kitchen window. Hannah was standing by the sink with her gloves off, as if thinking something through aloud. I slowed my pace and pressed my ear to the brick like a child eavesdropping on a forbidden tale. "Yes, it's done," she said into the phone in a voice that had the brittle triumph of someone counting spoils. "The durable power of attorney went through. The transfer cleared. We'll keep it quiet until the probate. No one will suspect." I could not see the other end of the call, but I knew the shape of the sentence like a familiar coat. I pressed my hand to the wall until the warmth of the brick bled into my palm. My mind, which had been a soft garden, hardened into resolve. Here was the rope I had been searching for. I walked home and set up, like a woman preparing jam, the slow appliances of a plan. I had evidence now: photocopies from probate court, bank transfer records, pawnshop receipts, and a phone call. The collection of small, ordinary things had begun to form a case. But proof in paper is only one language of truth. There was also the matter of motive, and motive can be loud in small things like invitations and new portraits. I went to the municipal archives and found, tucked in the ledger of property deeds, an undated letter addressed to my son. It was draft-like, beginning in a hand that wanted to be anonymous but could not quite escape its careful curves. The letter proposed, in polite terms, the advantages of reallocating the family trust to insulate assets and proposed Hannah's parents as beneficiaries in the interest of harmonizing family connections. It was unsigned but had initials. AJ. The signature matched none of the hands I knew, yet it bore the same cadence as the firm of Mason and Reed's external counsel, as if someone with legal training had penned a plan to convert affection into inventory. Each discovery was like finding a new room in a house you thought you knew. One door after another opened to reveal corridors of calculation. The more I saw, the more my son seemed not to be a villain born, but a man transformed by the help of those who saw him as an instrument. The betrayal was not a single slap, but a slow architecture of decisions, arranged like dominoes. And the dominoes were falling. At the midpoint of this descent, and after I had collected evidence enough to wobble a table, I had a conversation with myself, as one speaks in front of the mirror when one must choose how to wash one's face. I asked, who am I if I do not act? To remain quiet would be to pretend that love has no claws. Love that does not protect is a soft thing, but love that turns into expectation can be wrenched. If a daughter-in-law and her parents could reframe a son's life into ledgers and trust funds, then I needed more than indignation. I needed a strategy. I visited the courthouse again and spoke with probate clerk Harlan. He advised me to secure an emergency injunction to freeze distributions if I could demonstrate immediate risk of irreparable harm. You will need counsel, he said kindly, handing me a piece of paper with a list of attorneys who take such matters pro bono. The sun outside was low, and the courthouse clock read 4:42 p.m. It felt like a bell ringing for a moment before the tide. A moral aside, as the old books say, must be allowed here. When families trade their memories for ledgers, they impoverish themselves in spirit. Greed dresses itself often in the soft garb of prudence. It calls inventories by the names of tradition. Never confuse thrift with theft, for one gives while the other takes under a dictionary of legality. I went to a consultation with one of the pro bono attorneys, a sharp woman named Rachel Klein, who smelled faintly of orange peel and determination. She wanted to know dates, signatures, and places. She wanted me to tell the story simply. Elder financial abuse, she said, and the phrase rattled like a distant train. We can petition for temporary restraining order and an emergency freeze on the assets with the probate judge if we file an affidavit of facts and evidence by Monday, January 20th. Monday. The date beat in my head like a drum. Do you have any proof of undue influence? She asked. The question made me think of Hannah standing by the sink, gloves in hand, a phone line humming like an accomplice. I answered truthfully, I have a forged codicil, bank transfers, a pawnshop receipt, and a recorded phone call. Rachel's eyebrows rose, and for the first time in many days, I did not feel small. We set a plan in motion. Rachel drafted a complaint for declaratory relief, accompanied by an affidavit of forgery, pulling together the evidence I had gathered. We requested a temporary restraining order, TRO, to freeze account 44802 and any disbursements from the identified trust pending further hearing. The filing was made on January 19th at 4:05 p.m. The judge, a man with a voice like oak, granted our request for an emergency hearing on January 22nd at 9 a.m. The legal machinery, slow and lumbering, began to move like an awakened elephant. I felt the earth shift beneath the feet of a woman who had been told to sit down and be quiet. Yet opposition does not like to be surprised. On January 20th at 11:12 p.m., an envelope arrived at my door. Inside, placed like an accusation, was a notarized affidavit sworn by Mark stating that all signatures were his, that he authorized the transfer of $230,000 to the family trust for the benefit of the future welfare of his immediate family. His words, typed and formal, read like a confession of duty. They also read like a preemptive strike. Who had coached him into this tone? Who had convinced him that legalese could absolve a heart? I felt as if a hand had closed on my throat. I decided then that I would not rely on the mercy of hearts that had been replaced with ledgers. I would not only go to court, I would bring to court the truth in a voice they could not ignore. To do so, I needed a final instrument, not just paperwork, but a moment of public revelation that would create an irreversible turning point. And for that I required something more intimate than photocopies, a voice that could not be reinterpreted, an admission or a confession or something close to it. I remembered the ringing I had heard through the window and how Hannah had said, "Yes, it's done." I realized then that if I could capture more than words, if I could capture the cadence of triumph, it would become evidence of intent. On January 21st at 7:35 p.m., under the pretense of delivering a casserole to the house I had once called home, I stood at their kitchen door with my arm full of stale bread and my chin up like a woman who will not be shamed further. Hannah opened the door, surprised but polite. "I thought you weren't invited," she said, with a smile like a curtain pulled half across a window. She froze mid-sentence, as if surprised by the weight of a kettle. I asked to come in. She allowed it with the wary hospitality of those who believe appearances matter more than the truth. The kitchen was warm with the smell of simmering stock. I set the casserole on the island and spoke to Mark about the court date with Rachel. He fidgeted with a napkin. Hannah moved to the phone to take a call, and, as if in the friction of her movements, she uttered words that were small and clear, and to my ears were the thing I needed. "It's all set," she murmured into the phone, not thinking I would be close enough to hear. "We just need to keep the narrative tight. If Margaret stirs up a scene, we portray concern and not greed." She laughed softly, a sound pitched to closed doors. The man on the other end, whom I could not see, said something that made her reply in a whisper of triumph. She used the words durable power and probate and seal the account. My heart hammered like someone knocking at a locked house. I had a small digital recorder tucked in the lining of my purse because I had learned that the law sometimes listens to the mechanical ear when human ears fail. My hand moved like a machine accustomed to gloves, and I pressed play on the device. The red light blinked like a heart that had been waiting. For years I had thought of my son as my safe room, the place my secrets could sleep. Now I pressed the cassette of truth to my chest, as if I were that safe. I left their house as the kettle hissed and the evening turned soft around the street lamps. Back home, I listened through the recording and heard Hannah's voice the way one reads a confession in print. Definite, unrepentant, and smug. There it was, a deliberate cadence. We just need to keep the narrative tight. Seal the account. Durable power. Intent crystallized. I stored the recording in my mason jar next to the receipts and the photograph and the pennies. It felt obscene and holy at the same time. And then, in the gray light of late January, with papers filed and a hearing set, with the TRO in hand and a recorder that recorded not only sound but motive, I made the choice that would change the course of all our lives. I would go to court. I would not be the woman whose gestures softened the edges of dispute. I would not be the small figure who waited for apologies. I would become the woman who holds evidence up in a public room and asks a judge to see what was done. A moral truth weighs on the soul like a crown. There are moments when dignity must be defended, not only by words, but by action. We are judged in the deeds we do when our hearts are bleeding. The day of the emergency hearing arrived on January 22nd at 9:40 a.m. The courtroom smelled like paper and metal, and the faint perfume of an old woman's courage. I sat in the second row, my chipped mug wrapped in a brown paper bag as if it were a talisman. Rachel stood beside me, a sword by my side sharpened with law. Across the room, Mark and Hannah sat like a portrait of a modern family. Handsome clothes, composed faces, hands that did not tremble. Mason and Reed's partner, a Mr. Reed with a voice like a polished gravel road, represented them. He smiled with a smile that pretends knowledge it does not own. When the judge called the court to order, the room tightened like a fist. Rachel laid out our affidavit, the photocopies of the will, the forged codicil, bank transfers, the pawnshop receipt for pearls, and the recording of Hannah's call. She spoke in measured sentences, and each item she presented felt like a bell struck. Mr. Reed rose, smooth as a glass of fine wine, and spoke on their behalf. "My clients deny any wrongdoing," he said. He called our argument speculative and waved a hand over the papers as if to indicate their insufficiency. "We have presented documents that show valid signatures, duly notarized," he said. He spoke the language of law, as if by reciting it he could make the sunless things bright. At one point, the judge asked Mark to stand and to answer questions about his signature and the circumstances in which the durable power of attorney had been signed on April 3rd. Mark's throat worked in a way I had not seen since he was a boy, trying to climb the fence in August. "It was for convenience," he repeated like a parrot trained to echo safety. The judge asked, "Were you under any undue influence when you signed these documents?" Mark's eyes slid from the judge to Hannah as if seeking permission. "No," he said. "I was of sound mind." His voice was steady, but his hands were not. Rachel called me forward as a witness. I told the court what I had seen, what I had heard, how the pearls were pawned, about the $230,000 transferred June 14th, account 44802 to H. Whitmore, Family Trust, and how the April 3rd codicil had appeared the day after an earlier amendment. I placed in the judge's hands the photocopies and the recording. The judge listened, and as his face registered the points Rachel made, I felt the floor beneath me shift. Evidence is a peculiar kind of light. It does not lie, but it can be refracted. Mr. Reed objected to the recording's admission, claiming it to be hearsay and improperly obtained. The judge took a breath and ruled that the recording was admissible as a statement against interest because it was the opposing party's own words indicating intent. The courtroom seemed to tilt toward me, as if a window had been opened and a breeze allowed in. It was at that precise, irreversible moment, when the judge ruled that the recording could be heard, that my life poured itself into a new channel. Mark looked at me then with an expression of betrayal, as if the anger he felt for me could be used as armor against the truth. Hannah's face did something I had never seen before, a micro crack of panic across her practiced composure. Mr. Reed leaned forward, impressed but not yet defeated. The judge, a man older than all of us in ways that made his eyes kind, set a preliminary injunction. The accounts would be frozen, the transfers would be halted pending further investigation, and a full hearing would be scheduled for March 3rd at 10 a.m. He instructed both parties to preserve evidence. The judge's gavel came down like a bell. I felt like a woman who had climbed to the top of a stepladder and could not yet see the roof she had been aiming for. The words in that room were both a victory and a prelude. Mark's affidavit still stood as a public declaration. Mr. Reed had already filed a motion to strike the evidence and to request a continuance. The fight was no longer only in paper. It had teeth now. Before the courthouse emptied, Rachel whispered to me, "We have them on intent and motive. That recording will make a jury hear deliberate action." I pressed my hand into hers as if into the hand of a surgeon. The next moves would be surgical. I left the courthouse and felt the January air like a reprimand. The mason jar of evidence grew heavier in my bag. A small line of verse from an ancient book unfurled in my thoughts then. Revenge, like a winter river, freezes the tongue. I am not a woman given to revenge for its own sake. I sought only justice, yet the line is true. Once a person tastes the ability to right a wrong, to restore a name, a certain chill can set into the process. It is both hunger and discipline. That night, back at home with the mason jar on my table and the pearls receipt beside it, I played the recording again and again. Hannah's voice sounded smaller when I listened with full attention. I realized that the evidence would do more than freeze an account. It would force a conversation my son had been unwilling to have face to face. It would expose the architecture of choices. And in that exposure, there would be irreversibility. When a judge hears a voice admitting intent, when a transfer is halted, when a woman's pearls are tracked to a pawn shop, there is no mending by simple apology. I did not yet know what would happen on March 3rd. I did not yet know if the truth would be enough to bring back what was taken to me. My dignity, perhaps an apology, perhaps the house I remembered. But I had a new fact. I had decided to fight. Once a fight is chosen, There is no returning to the old table where one pretends nothing has been lost. One final moral sentence, because Dumas would have me do so. When a family substitutes account numbers for human names, it forgets that a ledger cannot hold the things a heart remembers. Greed rearranges the furniture of affection and pretends the house still smells the same. The judge scheduled March 3rd. Mr. Reed filed motions to exclude evidence. Mark's notarized affidavit stayed in the file like a stubborn root. Hannah did not speak to me when we passed on the sidewalk. She only looked away, her face an alabaster mask, creased with the calculation of one who believes she can civilize even the ugliest of acts. I thought, in the quiet after the hearing, that the hardest part of this was not the paperwork, but the silence at the table I had once laid with my hands. The children who used to pile into chairs like a clatter of spoons were replaced by polished place settings and a quiet that pretended tradition was only what one displays. I had to decide whether to clutter my days with memory or to tidy them with truth. The next morning, a letter arrived, thin as a wafer, with no return address. Inside was a single business card, M. Whitmore, trustee. On the back, in a handwriting that resembled my son's signature but with an unfamiliar pressure, were the words, "There are things you do not know. Meet me tonight at 8:09 p.m. at the old pier behind the mill." I folded the card like a confession. My heart hammered with a mixture of fear and the old hopeful steadiness of a woman waiting to be told a child's first lie. I went to the pier at 7:45, the day cold and the sky heavy as if ready to spill. The old mill was a silhouette of time when people used water to power what steam and electricity now do with ease. Mark arrived at 8:03 p.m., his coat buttoned high, breath puffing small clouds. He looked smaller in the open air than he had in the courtroom. The light from the street lamp painted him in gold and shadow. We spoke at first in the language of weather, small talk that was, in truth, an armor. I asked him plainly about the signature and about the codicil. For a while he offered explanation without ownership, and then, like a child who has been found with a jar of jam, he began to unravel. He told me, trembling, of meetings where Hannah's parents had suggested insulation of assets, of nights where they had fed him legalese until his head spun. He spoke of a dinner on April 2nd, where, wine loosened, he had signed a durable power of attorney, not understanding its reach. "They told me it was housekeeping," he said, voice small. "They said it would make taxes easier, that it would be held until probate." He spoke as if naming a voice that had guided him. "I didn't know they would put the codicil through the next day, Mom. I didn't look. I didn't—" He stopped. There are moments when a child's confession is a blade and a balm both. I felt a tide of emotions turn in me. The old love, the fault, the hurt. He looked at me and said, "I was afraid. It is a child's word at 40. But fear can be fashioned by architects, and when architects are persuasive, buildings of shame can be erected quickly." I asked him then, quietly, "Did you sign the pawn slip?" He hesitated. "No," he said. "I didn't." He seemed relieved to be absolved of that particular blemish. But relief in a man's face is often a mask and not a cure. I pressed as gently as one presses a wound. "Tell me the truth, Mark." The cold night pressed on us, and he folded into inevitability. He admitted that he had felt pressured, that he was embarrassed, and that he had forgotten to consult me. But he denied active conspiracy. "Hannah wanted to protect the children's future," he said. "She said it was the prudent choice." I listened. And then, like a bell, the truth became less muddied and more precise. Complicity had many faces, the enthusiastic, the passive, the manipulated. The courtroom would decide degrees, but the winter had turned irrevocably. He had been handed a legal path and had walked it. He had not forged the signature. Perhaps he had not even read the papers. But he had signed. He had let distance grow. I left the pier with his confession folded in my coat like extra fuel. The clock read 10:12 p.m. The path ahead was dangerous and certain. The judge had heard us. The motion to exclude the recording would be argued. The March hearing would come. The file stacks would shuffle like a deck of cards in a game where the stakes had been raised. I knew, with a clarity that had the shock of first light, that there would be no return to the status quo. I had chosen to speak, to press, to gather witnesses, to show handwriting that did not belong, to bring a sound into a courtroom. Once sound is heard publicly, it acquires a life beyond any one person's control. I had also discovered, in that peer conversation, that my son was not the architect, but a worker who had been enlisted. That made the battle both more painful and more necessary. For if a man can be persuaded to betray his mother, what prevents the same persuasion from taking the last of a widow's pension or the name from a grave? I was now, whether I liked it or not, a sentinel. The night before the scheduled motion hearing, an envelope was slipped under my door with no return address. Inside was a photograph of my own kitchen table from the day I had taken the codicil folder home. On the back, in a hand I recognized with the old sharp clarity of domestic life, was a single sentence. "You are overreaching, Margaret." It was signed, H. Whitmore. I held the photograph until the paper warmed from my hands. They knew I was gathering. They knew I would not be silent. The photograph felt like both an insult and a threat. I placed it in the mason jar. The papers, the recordings, the receipts, they began to feel less like objects and more like witnesses in a room where truth would either be cleansed or buried. The morning of the motion hearing dawned raw and bright. I put on my coat and my old pearls, the string I had insisted on wearing like a talisman, and walked into court. The battle lines were drawn. I had done the work of collecting the loose threads. The scene was about to be tested. There would be lawyers, motions, and a judge's hand. I would not go in as a supplicant, but as someone who had come to collect what had been hidden. I never expected what would happen next. The morning of March 3rd arrived like a promise wrapped in gray cloth. I woke with the thin, metallic taste of nerves in my mouth and the mason jar of evidence heavy in my bag, as if the pennies themselves were anchors. The courthouse clock read 8:15 a.m. when I stepped through the doors. The air smelled of old coffee and the sharp paper of human affairs. Rachel squeezed my hand once in the hallway and said, in that businesslike voice that keeps a heart from scattering, "We are ready." I felt like a soldier who has put on armor she does not like, but who understands that armor saves the ribs. The courtroom at 10 a.m. filled. There were people in suits who measured their breaths like inventory, and there were ordinary neighbors who had heard whispers and come, curious or compassionate. I saw Paul in the second row, his reading glasses like two small moons on his nose, and Mrs. Alvarez with a thermos and a look that said she would have raised a hand in any weather. When the judge called the case, the room seemed to lean forward as if it wanted the next chapter. Mr. Reed, polished like a new coin, rose and presented an opening that smelled of careful planning. Mark had acted in good faith, he said, and any transfers had been made with valid documentation. He argued that the durable power of attorney, signed April 3rd, had been rendered in Mark's hand and that the bank had followed procedure. He smiled the smile of those who believe law is an instrument that can be tuned to the song they prefer. Rachel answered with a voice that had the texture of steel wrapped in velvet. She placed our affidavit of forgery and our exhibits on the table for the judge to see. The photocopied will dated March 12, 2018, the codicil of April 2, 2024, the contested codicil of April 3, 2024, the bank transfer records showing $230,000 moved on June 14th at 11:23 a.m. to account ending in 76624 labeled H. Whitmore Family Trust. The pawnshop receipt, transaction, Morm MTP 2024 1 Aveniro 2, showing my pearls pawned July 2nd for $420. Paul's handwriting analysis, and the recording I had taken on January 21st in their kitchen. Rachel's hands were calm as she presented each piece. Each sounded like a bell in the space between us. The judge, a man named Alden with eyes that had watched many human dramas, listened with the temper of someone assessing a great tapestry. He allowed Paul to testify about the handwriting. Paul described simply the loop that did not belong and the hesitation that should have been there. He spoke of practice strokes and how the April 3rd signature resembled a practiced copy more than a living hand. The pawnbroker took the stand and told the court, under oath, that the signature on the pawn slip matched the sample he had been shown, and that the pearls had been handed over by a woman who gave the name H. Whitmore. The bank manager, L. Patterson, explained the bank's process and how staff had relied upon documents tendered by someone bearing the durable power of attorney. The room was a small theater of truth and evasion. Mr. Reed attacked the evidence in the way a storm attacks a shore, by arriving in many small, persistent waves. He moved to exclude the recording on grounds of hearsay and claimed it had been improperly obtained. I felt the old fear sift back into my bones. But Rachel stood up as if to say, no. She argued that the recording, being a statement of an opposing party indicating intent and motive, was admissible as an exception to hearsay. She reminded the judge of our earlier TRO issued on January 22nd and the need to consider whether the transfer had been effected through undue influence and possible forgery. The judge, after a moment that seemed to stretch like taffy, ruled to admit the recording as a statement against interest. A hush fell like snow in a room. I sat very still as Rachel clicked the player and Hannah's voice filled the air. It was like listening to someone read a line of a crime in print, calm, ordinary, triumphant. "We just need to keep the narrative tight," she said. The words sounded as if someone had poured molten lead into the seams of an argument. The judge's face hardening and the way his hand brushed his chin told me that the world I had been living in, where my son's warmth could be used as currency, had finally been called to account. One sentence. They had spoken their intent aloud. The prosecutor did not speak, for this was a civil hearing. But the judge's demeanor had changed from a man who measures documents to someone who now weighed motive. Mr. Reed attempted to frame the pawned pearls as a mere oversight, an unfortunate but explainable event. He suggested that Mark and Hannah had not intended harm. He painted them as modern people who had made practical choices for their children's stability. It was a paint job that smelled faintly of varnish. He questioned Paul's amateur status as an analyst and attempted to discredit the pawn shop as an unreliable witness. But the record is a patient creature. The bank statements were there, the pawn shop ledger was there, and the recording, that most human of traps, was undeniably there. Then Mark stood. He had been at the center of the storm all along, and he appeared smaller than his suit. He took the stand like a man who had walked into winter without his coat and now felt the cold. His voice was low and honest in a way that no lawyer could sculpt. He told the court that he had not read the documents fully, that he had signed something he considered housekeeping. After a dinner on April 2nd where wine aged in, persuasion and where Hannah's parents had spoken of, ensuring the future. He spoke of confusion, and of a creeping distance he had allowed between himself and me. He looked at me then, and there was a child's shame in adult shape. "I'm sorry, Mum," he said. "I did not mean to erase you." His apology, raw and public, landed like a stone dropped into a well, but apology does not always repair a theft. The judge asked pointed questions about whether Mark had been under undue influence. The judge's legal analysis turned on whether the April 3rd codicil had been procured through coercion or drafted and signed without true volition. The presence of the recording, where Hannah speaks of sealing accounts and guarding the narrative, lent weight to the claim of intentionality. When cross-examined, Hannah's composure cracked in the way the surface of a porcelain bowl sometimes reveals a hairline fracture. She insisted she had acted prudently, that everything had been done to secure the family's future. The judge, watching her, seemed to see the difference between prudence and predation. I watched the courtroom like a woman watching bread rise, with impatience and hope. Then at 2:30 p.m., the turning point came. The clerk handed a sealed envelope to Rachel, who opened it with the kind of careful hands you give to old letters. It was a set of phone records subpoenaed overnight. The logs showed multiple calls between Hannah and an individual identified as A. Jameson, initials I had seen before, on the evenings of April 2nd and April 3rd. Timestamps that matched the drafting and notarization of the codicil. The cadence of the calls suggested deliberate, repeated contact. When confronted, Mr. Jameson, who sat in the gallery thin and white-lipped, rose to identify himself as Arthur Jameson, Hannah's father. He had legal expertise, the court discovered. He had drafted the language that would rearrange our lives and had advised how to insulate assets. There was an audible intake of breath. The candle of illusion flickered. The judge's gavel tapped like a heartbeat. Jameson attempted to say his counsel had been benign. Advice on estate planning, he called it. But the judge's query was sharp. Did you draft the April 3rd codicil and advise that it be put into effect immediately? Mr. Jameson stuttered, then gave an evasive answer that cracked. Under cross-examination, the logs and the draft letters showed a coordinated plan. The picture that formed was no longer one of accident, but of architecture, an architecture of exclusion erected by design. A moral aside, because of how the world sometimes needs a bell to ring before truth is spoken. When men and women construct a family like a ledger, they forget that hearts are not accounts. They bear fingerprints no balance sheet can tally. The courtroom scene shifted from legal to theatrical. Mr. Reed, for the first time, looked uneasy. The varnish was dulling. The judge, with a gravity that felt like scripture, noted the totality of the evidence. The forged aspects of the April 3rd signature indicated practice strokes inconsistent with Mark's typical hand. The bank transfers and pawnshop receipts mapped a course of conversion of both liquid assets and personal effects. The phone logs and recorded conversation indicated intentional planning. Judge Alden, in a voice that was not unkind, said, I find probable cause to believe that the April 3rd codicil was procured through undue influence and that certain signatures are inconsistent with the decedent's known handwriting. Pending further criminal investigation, I will order the following. The April 3rd codicil is temporarily set aside. Account 44802 is to remain frozen and placed under the control of a court-appointed independent trustee. The pawned personal effects are to be identified and, if recoverable, returned to the estate. And I will refer this matter to the district attorney for potential charges, including forgery and elder financial abuse. The gavel struck, and the sound was as close to thunder as a man with a wooden hammer can make. I felt as if my life, which had been a thin thread, had tied into a rope. I left the courtroom that day shaken, but not unmade. The judge's order meant the immediate future had shifted. The accounts were frozen. The April 3rd amendments were void pending investigation. The pearls might be recovered. And, most importantly, the public record had acknowledged that harm had been done. The DA's office opened an inquiry, and Arthur Jameson was subpoenaed for further testimony. The social circle that had once polished Hannah's parents' invitations began to look away in the weeks that followed. Invitations retreated like winter geese. The papers, small-town columns and then regional pieces, ran with headlines that called for the exacting scrutiny of a household's betrayal. There is no theater greater than the public airing of private treasons. I received phone calls from neighbors and distant relatives. Some spoke in hushed tones of the greed of newcomers. Others, tougher and kinder, asked if I was all right. My heart was bruised but mending in the way old wood does when it is sanded and resealed. The pearls, thank God, were returned by the pawnshop after a court order and a payment by the court-appointed trustee to reimburse the pawnbroker. They came back dull and small as if sighing from their own ordeal. Paul came by and polished them with old tea-cloth, and when he handed them to me, they shimmered with the light only an object that has survived indignity can claim. I clasped them around my throat and felt at last the private part of a victory. Mark came to me with a sorrow so palpable I could have held it like a child. He had been removed as executor by a temporary order given the judge's finding of probable cause. The court appointed an independent trustee to manage the trust pending the outcome of the DA's inquiry, and the probate judge restored the previous distributions per the March 12, 2018 will and the April 2nd codicil. In plain language, the April 3rd codicil was voided, and the assets reverted to their prior intended channels. That meant the $230,000 traced to account 448-02 was subject to recovery and redirection consistent with the original estate plan. How the money would be accounted for in full would be determined with the bank's cooperation and the trustee's oversight. I will not indulge fantasies of immediate riches. What returned was an accounting, a correction, and the promise of writing a record. There was humiliation for those who had plotted. Hannah and her parents found the social litany of invitations dwindling. Friends called to say they were uncomfortable. The very people who had once admired their cleverness now measured them with small, cold curiosity. Justice, when it arrives, is not only a legal act, but a social corrosion of trust. Those who bank upon a reputation to shield them are often the first to see their doors close. The DA's inquiry lingered like a hawk. Subpoenas were issued. Arthur Jameson's legal practice was shadowed by the weight of public scrutiny. Whether the DA would file criminal charges for forgery and elder financial abuse remained to be seen. But the referral itself was a serious and public admonition. What became more consequential for me, beyond the legal mechanics, was the way my son returned to me, smaller, truer, a man with tears he was not ashamed to let fall. He helped me carry the groceries. He sat at my table with hands that trembled and spoke of mistakes, of the slow corrosion of love when new family allegiances grow like ivy over old stone. We did not suddenly become the family of old postcards. Reconciliation is a slow stitch. He asked to be allowed to earn back trust, and I, a woman who has ironed shirts and baked bread and known the currency of time, agreed to the slow work of mending. I set a condition that he attend family counseling and that he collaborate with the trustee to make restitution. He accepted. It is not heroism. It is a modest and honest task. A final confrontation did occur, but not as a grand duel in the square. It was quieter, a hearing where the judge entered an order on May 12th that formally set aside the April 3rd codicil, ordered restitution measures, and referred the matter to the DA for criminal review. The order required that any funds improperly disbursed be recovered to the trust, and that Ms. Hannah Whitmore and Mr. Arthur Jameson return any personal effects taken or reveal their disposition. The Pearl incident was cited as an example of conversion of personal property. The judge's language was stern, and he concluded by saying that familial trust is no shield for predation. There was, in the phrasing, a moral weight I had not thought to ask of the law but was grateful to receive. Before that last order, a thought rose that felt like a line from a book I had once read aloud to a little boy who now sat across from me in court, that the heart is the first home, and when it is betrayed, one must not make a new house upon the ruins of the old. That burst of Dumas-like thought felt foolish in my mouth and right in my bones. The law can rebalance what men have tried to steal, but it also must teach that a family without honor is a mansion built on sand. Justice had done much and would do more. The social consequences for Hannah and her parents unfolded like a slow curtain. The bank balanced the books. The trustee held the line. For me, the house that I had once known as a place of warmth and childish laughter was never fully restored to what it had been, which is as it should be. Memory is not a transaction, yet I gained something that the codicil could not have removed. My name was restored in public record. The pearls were on my throat again, and my mason jar, that small, faithful archive of a life, felt less like a relic and more like evidence of endurance. In the weeks that followed, neighbors came by with casseroles and with cautious talk. Some asked for gossip, some for consolation. I told them the truth plainly, that my son had erred and had been influenced, that the law had been our shield, that if you see an old person with less than a trustee's worth, do not presume they need no protection. The DA's office later announced an indictment of Arthur Jameson on charges of conspiracy to commit forgery and financial exploitation of the elderly. Mr. Jameson entered a plea of not guilty, and the case proceeded to trial. Whether a man is found guilty in criminal court does not erase the moral failure that drove this from the start. But the criminal process, if it follows its arc, will bring another measure of accountability. And then something simpler happened. It was Christmas the next year. Mark came, as did the grandchildren, with their cheeks pink and their pockets full of small, newly earned coins. We set a smaller table than the one that had once been laden with porcelain and proof, but the table had warmth. I wore the pearls. The mason jar sat in a place of honor like a relic we no longer needed to hide. We ate soup and spoke of small things. Mark did not pretend everything had been untouched. He sat and listened. Hannah did not come. Her absence, while painful in its own way, no longer carved my days. The world had made room for the consequences of her choices. Poetic justice is often quieter than revenge. It is not the breaking of a glass over a head, but the deliberate recovery of truth. Hannah and her parents had their own reckonings, not all of which will be told here, and the community, which once measured them in invitations, now measured them in absence. I, awkward and old, had won something better than money, the public recognition that what was done to me was wrong. I had my name back. I had my dignity. I had, in a strange and slow currency, the restoration of the right story. If there is a moral I ought to leave you with, and Dumas would have me lift a torch and speak it in an elevated tone, here it is. Betrayals begin as small economies of convenience. They become empires of theft when neighbors choose silence. Courage, like charity, begins at the hearth but thrives in public. Protect the elderly in your life, not because they are frail, but because their stories are sovereign. I will admit to you, in the hush that follows a long storm, that the victory did not feel like gloating. It felt like sunlight. My hands no longer tremble as much when I hold the chipped mug. I gave interviews, awkward as only an old woman can be on a microphone, and the truth moved in people like tide. I am not cruel. I forgave my son in the way a gardener forgives a wayward plant that has outgrown its pot, by transplanting it into better soil and changing the conditions so it may flourish honestly. If my story touched you, if you felt the sting of cold words in a warm house, then pass this on to someone who might need it. Share it with a neighbor, with an aunt, with a bank clerk who thinks paperwork is all there is to a person. Tell the story of the mason jar and the pearls and the durable power of attorney so that someone else might recognize the first thread before the seam comes undone. And if you want to hear more confessions, more quiet triumphs, more small tales from this old heart, subscribe and stay. I have many more truths to tell, and if anything I have learned is true, it is that truth shared is a kind of warmth. So, my dears, keep your names close, keep your prayers closer, and do not ever allow convenience to be the thief of love.